We are good to go.
Chapter are we on?
Chapter 11 and 12.
Chapter 11?
Chapter 11. Yep.
Here.
We are good.
Chapter are we on?
Chapter 11. All right. So, darn it. All my best laid plans. I got distracted this morning and I never sent out a reminder note to people. So that's probably a small group.
We're here.
Well, we'll just make do. So these are some interesting chapters that we've got over the next couple of weeks. It's a very interesting sort of set of chapters that. So next week we're going to try to get through 3 chapters because there's a lot of lists, a lot of geographical information, and things move kind of fast. And a lot of what's interesting is sort of in the category of sort of what's included and what's not included, rather than in any sort of narrative, compelling narrative. What we have in chapter 11 and 12 is the final part, I guess you would say, the final portion of the conquest of the land, right? Which seems on one hand a little funny, right? Because wait, we're only 12 chapters in and that's it, no more conquest. But when we get to chapter 13, right, we'll see that things are not quite that simple. And kind of the rest of the historical prophets is sort of about how it's the idea of conquering the land is not a simple thing. As anyone who lived through, say, the war in Afghanistan, I guess we're still living through that war, right? Or in the war in Iraq, right? That it's one thing to go in and to defeat a country's military, right, and to quote unquote occupy them. It's quite another thing, right, to have a successful occupation. And so it's interesting to see how the Bible sort of deals with that reality. Hello, Connie.
Hi,
Nice to see your C. I don't see your face, but I see a C, so
I don't know how to do it.
it's something. All right. So let's get started. I will put chapter 11 on the screen here. I guess what's interesting. Oh, this is chapter 13. Let me do chapter 11. Where did it go? That's very strange. This is very strange. I apologize. This is very, very weird. Oh man, I apologize for the strangeness of this situation. I just had the sheet ready to go, and lo and behold, it's not here. So we'll go to Plan B. I love going to Plan B. So. All right, so go to Joshua chapter 11. Okay. All right, so chapter 11, and I'll read this, the book that I'm going to be reading from is the JPS translation. What's on the screen is the old JPS, much more along the lines of the King James, but the idea is the same. All right, so one thing is going to sound very familiar right at the beginning of the chapter, right? When news reached King Jabin of Hazor, he sent messages to King Yobab at Madon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Shaph, and to the other kings of the north, in the hill country, in the Arava south of Kinneret, in the lowlands, and in the district of Dor on the west. To the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites, and to the Hivites at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. They took the field with all their armies, an enormous host, as numerous as the sand of the seashore, a vast multitude of horses and chariots. So they're fighting with horses and chariots. All these kings and forces, they came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to give battle to Israel. Right? So very interesting, right, that we have a similar situation to what we had in the previous chapter, right, where we have one king who's trying to sort of make a united front against these terrible Israelites who are conquering everything in their way. All right, but the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them. Tomorrow at this time I will have them all lying slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots." Which is awful, right? It's an awful image, both in terms of the killing all of the soldiers, but also in hamstring, destroying the horses, right? And what one of the sources that I looked at said that that the point is that they viewed horses not as animals so much as military technology. That horses didn't really have any other function at this time. They weren't used for plowing or for agriculture. So it seemed okay to kill them. Go ahead, Connie. But you're muted, Connie. You're still muted.
Now?
There you go. There you go.
Oh, so they weren't going to be used for war anymore, but their only use was now for domestic use.
Right. Now they're only used for domestic use. Back then, I guess they were only for war, which is so it's awful, right? I mean, the cruelty, just sort of goes hand in hand with the cruelty of what seemed to be sort of de rigueur in the ancient world. So hello, I see we have someone else on the phone. Who's joined us?
That's Phyllis.
Phyllis, great.
I have a question,
Yeah.
as long as you have me on the phone. In the story of David, it seems that God can only be asked questions that are binary,
Yes.
and here God gives kind of elaborate instructions.
Yes. You're anticipating, Phyllis, one of the aspects of Joshua, and I would say of the historical prophetic books in general, right? That we have a kind of sequence of God sort of withdrawing God's self from active engagement in any sort of obvious way. Yeah, go ahead. Ann. It sounds like maybe you want to. Ann wants to say something, and I'll get back to that. Yeah, and then Connie again.
Okay, well, this is an interesting translation. I have here
Yeah.
the old GPS translation. And in that last verse, number 6, says, you shall lame their horses. And in the one that you had on the screen, it said you shall huff, Hough.
Their horses. Yeah.
Now, I majored in English literature. I never heard of the word huff without something else in front of it. I mean, I've never heard of that word. I'm not a horse person, but why would they put a word like that that I have no idea what it is, except in context, when they had a perfectly good lane in there before? Seems like a
What does huff? So hamstringing. Huffing is hamstringing.
horse term, people that know horses.
Yeah, it's specifically for horses, but it says in Google that people can huff other people also. It's
Yes, definitely.
yeah, it's severing the hamstrings, so that the person can't walk properly, or so the creature can't walk properly.
It cuts the tendons behind your heel.
Yeah, yeah,
Has anybody else seen that usage of huff before?
yeah. Yeah, I'd never actually seen that word, so that's a new one for me. Not the nicest word though, I've got to say. But Phyllis is raising this question, right, of how God, what is the nature of God's withdrawal?
Yeah, well, prophecy changes. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't, it's not, I would say, at least, from the Bible's perspective, it's not the case that, excuse me, I'm just going to move myself a little bit. It's not the case from the Bible's perspective, I think, that God just disappears, right, and doesn't participate anymore. But I do think it's the case that.
Well, you're gone.
Yeah, I do think it's the case that the way God participates and the way God communicates definitely changes, right? It's very clear in the book of Samuel that that God is going to put the Philistines in under David's control. That David's going to destroy the Philistines, or this one's going to but as you said, Phyllis, right, that's only clear through the use of the Urim and Thummim, right? And then, but here, right, we definitely get much more full dialogue between Joshua and God, like we had with Moses. And to be clear about it, also the way we're going to get be different, right? Again, with the later prophets, where there's going to be the prophets are going to have these prophecies, right, that people are going to then have to make sense of, right? It's not going to be quite so clear. So go ahead, Connie.
Even though we know that that Joshua's going to smite everybody.
Yeah.
with God's help, I'm interested that the kings all are collaborating.
Yeah.
They're not separate out in their separate forts, and
Yeah.
they all agreed to meet together and fight together.
Right.
They
Right.
probably didn't know the role of God at that time.
It's a really interesting point, right? It's a really interesting point that there's this sort of this idea in Joshua, right, that the Canaanites, even though they were separate city states, right, that there was some sort of confederacy among them, which may reflect, in a sense, kind of a little bit of a mirror image of the ideal of the Israelites, right, which were separate tribes with separate areas, and which also had trouble very often playing nicely with each other, and sharing the sandbox appropriately. All right, so let's continue.
No, I'm quiet.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so you want to say something?
No.
Okay. All right. So Joshua, with all his fighting men, came upon them suddenly at the waters of Merom. All right. And pounced upon them. The Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel, and they defeated them and pursued them all the way to Great Sidon and Misrephothmaim, and all the way to the valley of Mizpeh on the east. They crushed them letting none escape. And Joshua did them as the Lord had ordered him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. Very interesting. I still find it interesting, right, that they would do that, right, rather than appropriating the horses and chariots for themselves. Right? I don't entirely understand that, but it's I guess that's just the way that it works. Okay. So Joshua then turned back and captured Hazor and put him to the sword. Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. All right, so the king of Hazor, right? That was the guy. Yeah.
The text is not going with you.
Say again?
The text is not going with you.
I apologize. I
You're
forgot.
still on the first page on verse 6. The last one is verse 6.
What's going on? Okay. So, and Joshua turned back, and at that time, and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword. And Hazor, before time, was the head of all those kingdoms. Right? So, as we see here, it was King Jabin of Hazor. He was the one who did the original convening of the various kings to fight the Israelites. And they smote there all the souls that were within therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left that breathed, and he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings and all the kings of them did Joshua take, and he smote them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only. That Joshua did burn. And all the spoil of these cities and the cattle the children of Israel took for a prey unto themselves. But every man they smote with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. Neither left they any that breathed. All right. Just as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses had charged Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. This is a very important verse to remember, especially when we get to chapter 13 next week, because it's going to be a very different story in chapter 13. Right? Joshua conquered the whole of the region. Okay, the hill country of Judah, the Negev, the whole land of Goshen, the Shephelah, the Arava, and the hill country, and the coastal plain of Israel. Everything from Mount Halak, which attends to Seir, all the way to Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all the kings there and executed them. Okay, so very interesting. This is like a guided tour, right, of the land of Israel, and very interesting. I saw a commentary that said on verse 17, right, from the bare mountains that goeth up to Seir, right. So the bare mountains is a different translation of Mount Halak. In verse 17, Mount Halak. Halak is the word for smooth. If you remember from the Torah, right? Jacob is an ish halak, right? A smooth man, meaning not hairy, right? And Seir is a hairy guy, right? Like Esau. And so this actually seems to be indicating that the whole range of this country, including Edom. All right. So there we go. So Joshua waged war with all these kings over a long period. Okay. Wait a second. Does that ring true?
Depends.
I'm sorry?
Depends on which verse you want to believe.
There we go. Right. Okay. So we've talked about this before, right? That the Bible will very, very often include material from different traditions, not because the compiler didn't know what he was doing, right, and not because there's some sort of major disagreement necessarily, but just that if there are multiple traditions, we don't like to lose them. right? So very interesting, right?
Wait a minute. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
But in other books, it seems like time has been telescoped, and maybe time is just telescoped here.
Exactly. And so Phyllis is also bringing up an important point, right? As we've sort of said in our discussions about the book of Samuel, right? That very often the Bible is not really that concerned with chronology, right? And so it'll handle handle 40 years, right, in a few sentences, and then get stuck on a few hours for chapters at a time, right?
Can I ask a strange question?
Sure.
I'm a little backward. How did Joshua first get appointed?
Oh, good question. All right, so Joshua is presented in Torah, right, the book of Numbers, and actually in the book of Exodus also, as being sort of Moses' servant or Moses' next, sort of next in line, Moses' assistant, and he is also famously one of the two spies, right? Caleb and Joshua are the two spies that bring back a positive report of the land of Israel.
Ah,
So they are the ones who are accepted. They're the exceptions to the rule that no one from the generation that left Egypt would enter the land, right? So they are being the only ones. So presumably they're pretty well advanced in age already by the time they come into the land and spend their time conquering. But I would say that this does appear, right, to be a sort of a separate kind of a tradition because it continues, right? There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took all of that in battle. All right, so we know about the Gibeonites, right? Or the Hivites, right? They were the ones that fooled Joshua into making a pact with them.
right.
But those people, right, the Hivites that lived in Gibeon, they were included among the kings. They were included among the peoples that King Jabin brought together. If you look at verse 3, right, he went to the Canaanite and the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite and the Hivite, right? So, it does seem clear that this is a slightly different tradition. All right, and this is
We also have all of the women and children here because they only killed the men a couple of verses back. So we've got a whole group that
Right.
have come along here.
Yeah.
They may not be happy about it, but
right. No, I don't. I mean, it's hard to ever be happy about that. So, and then just to continue, right? For it was the Lord's doing to stiffen their hearts to give battle to Israel, in order that they might be prescribed without quarter and wiped out, as the Lord had commanded Moses. So a very interesting verse, right? Which recalls for those of you who are familiar with the plagues, right? That it revives this sort of question, right, about God's participation in these battles, right? It's not only, right, that God said, okay, I'm going to put them into your hands, right? He does it by how? By stiffening their hearts, right? Hardening their hearts in the book, in the version I have on the screen, and stiffening their hearts, right? And so, there's always been a lot of questions and various interpretations of what it means. But what do you think in this case? Why is God stiffening their hearts or hardening their hearts?
because he's arbitrary and capricious.
Yeah, there we go. Go ahead, Connie.
We used to discuss whether or not, why did God harden Pharaoh's heart?
Yeah.
So God was responsible then. God's responsible now. God has the power to do this.
Yeah.
Shape these battles, shape the peace.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting, right? How on there is this question that will also come up later, right? Of who's responsible, right? Is this God's doing, right? Is it the Israelites doing, or is it in some senses the Canaanites doing, right? The Canaanites, you know, if God hardened their heart, did they have the opportunity to not let their hearts be hardened, right? And so the question of where, how do we sort of tease out uh, how this actually all came to pass is a really interesting one. Go ahead, Suzanne.
Okay, well, it said that God hardened their hearts. It made it easier for the battles to take place.
Right.
So, if people felt strongly that whoever they were looking at was their enemy, it would be easier for them to fight. But I know that there's some work in the Exodus that it was actually Pharaoh who hardened his own heart. But here it says, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts.
Yes.
So
Right.
it just made it all easier.
Right. So let's see. Very
But
interesting.
God could have equally softened their hearts.
Again?
God could equally have softened their hearts, no?
It's interesting.
And
Right.
allowed them to be subsumed into the nation of Israel.
Right. Right. It's a very interesting question, right? Because there are these traditions in the book of Joshua, right? That it seems like what Suzanne is saying makes a lot of sense to me, right? That if they never gave up, so that's an idea that hadn't really occurred to me. It's quite possible. Go ahead, Connie.
So what this source says, if they had just submitted without a fight,
Yeah.
the Israelites might have treated them with leniency,
Yeah.
not destroyed them. But in that event, they would have become a menace
Right.
to the communities with hedonism and Baal and
This is one of the ways that
rationale.
commentators make sense of this, right? Which is that this is not ethnic cleansing, right, or race-based genocide, right? This is that these people, right, are seen by God as the equivalent of Sodom and Gomorrah, right, and so that they need to be destroyed, right? They're already past any possibility of tshuva. I'm not sure that I am really that comfortable with that kind of reading, and I think I'm much more comfortable with what the text I think ultimately said, right? Is that there are these traditions, right, which are obviously very important to certain parts of the certain sort of schools of thought within our tradition and within Torah, right, that the Israelites did actually put everything to the sword, right? But the vast amount of the later evidence from the book of Joshua, from other books of prophets, right, is that the number of people that they actually got rid of was very, very few, because otherwise they wouldn't have had, this endless profusion of wars against all of these, right? So I think that a lot of it probably was wishful thinking, in a sort of particularly horrifying notion of wishful thinking, but still wishful thinking.
Yeah, but so in a sense, the Canaanites are being put in the position of where the Israelites were in Egypt, and the Egyptians are thinking they are too numerous.
Yeah, in a sense, right? In a sense, but but I think there's also, um, the, I think, the overall explanation of this story that does kind of ring true for me, right, is that the Israelites were actually a group of people who lived in the land of Canaan. They were a loose federation of tribes, right? And there was one group of them supposedly that came from Egypt, but the rest of them were already there, right? And there was this desire to make a unified kingdom of all of these groups, right? And one of the ways, right, that a nation might pull together, um, as is to have a founding myth, right? That they came into the country and they destroyed everyone that was there, right? So it's a founding myth from the very beginning, right?
Could is it possible? Excuse me. Is it possible that it kind of propagates the idea that the Jewish tribes are pure and not contaminated with any other tribes?
Right.
So they,
Right. I think, Phyllis, that you're making a good point, right? When you have a religious system, right, that emphasizes on one hand, right, a kind of an unbroken line back to a progenitor, right? It's very important to not be part of what we like to call the Erev Rav, right? The mixed multitude, right? On the other hand, the tradition is always very careful to say, right, that there should be one law for the citizen and the stranger, right? There's if a stranger wants to partake in the various sacrifices, he just has to make sure that all the men in his household are circumcised, right? And then they become sort of on par with the rest of the group. My guess, right, is that both of these things are going on at once, right? There's a desire to sort of posit a pure lineage, and there's also the reality, right, that Israel is always willing to sort of pull in very from all kinds of places, right?
Rabbi?
These things are working together in concert and in tension with one another. Yeah, go ahead, Ann.
Does it seem it seems a little like to me that God forced the opponents into a suicide,
Yeah,
hardening their heart, and made the others that could have changed their mind, the Israelites, wouldn't stop fighting because the others wouldn't stop fighting.
Right,
They
right.
took some of their blame off of them.
exactly.
Made them seem like better than they were.
But on the other hand, right? I think that there's so much ambivalence here. There's so much ambivalence, right? Because on one hand, God is telling them, you got to kill everybody. On the other hand, when we talked about the Gibeonites, right? Once they attacked with them, they wouldn't kill them. So I think there's a whole lot of complicated stuff that we probably from our vantage point, both because I'm not an expert in this and also because we're looking at it from thousands of years later, right, that it's a little bit difficult to tease out all the details. All right, but so let's continue with this very interesting stuff, right? And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim. The Anakim are the giants, right, that the spies saw when they visited the land of Canaan. There's an Anakim there. There's these giants, right? And cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anav, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their city. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, in Ashdod did some remain. All right, so this might ring a bell for those of you who are reading the book of Samuel with me, right? Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, right? That's where the Philistines live, right? That's
Right.
and
Goliath.
in Gath, that's where Goliath came from, right? That is it's Goliath's hometown. So uh, there's the actual history, right, of the land of Canaan, right, is even more complicated than it's right, because those people presumably at some point were the Philistines, right, who came supposedly from Greek-speaking area. Okay, and so at the end, right, what happened? Joshua took the whole land. I mean, it's amazing. He did the whole thing. It's over. That's the end of the story. We're done, right? Why is there all this? Why is there so much more Bible left? In 13, 12 chapters, he did the whole thing, or 11 chapters, he did the whole thing, right? According to all that the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land had a rest from war. All right, which is a stock phrase that will come up again and again in the historical prophets. I associated primarily with the Book of Judges, where there's these sort of cycles of war and peace, and so the land had a rest from war. All right, so that is the whole thing, right? But already because I've told you, right, and because of the clues that we've already seen in the text itself, where there do appear to be multiple strands of traditions that don't necessarily agree with one another, it does seem, right, that it's not as simple as all that. So let's go to verse 12, and we'll see what we do with this. Okay. All right, so this is interesting, right? So the following are the local kings whom the Israelites defeated and whose territories they took possession of. East of the Jordan, all right, so this is going back to before the book of Joshua, right, when we're still in the book of Numbers, right? From the Wadi Arnon to Mount Hermon, including the eastern half of the Arava, King Sichon of the Amorites. Oh my gosh, we're back to King Sichon, right? I think it's the favorite Canaanite king of the Bible, right? Because we hear his name over and over and over and over again. Okay, Sichon of the Amorites, who resided in Heshbon and ruled over part of Gilead, from Aroer to the bank of the Wadi Arnon, and the Wadi proper up to the Wadi Yabok, right, and the border of the Ammonites. And Yabok is an important place, right? That's where Jacob wrestled with Esau, or with the angel at least. Right? And over the eastern Arava up to the Sea of Kinneret, and southward by the way of Beth Yehimot, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah on the east, down to the Sea of Arava. That is the Dead Sea. Wow. So much detail, right? So much detail. Why so much detail? I'm really not sure, but very interesting, right? That there's this obsessive mapping of Sichon's area, right? And also the territory of King Og of Bashan, right? Og and Sichon usually go together. One of the last of the Rephaim. What is a Rephaim? Does anyone remember? A Rephaim in modern Hebrew is a ghost. So in Jerusalem, you have Emek Rephaim, which is like the Valley of the Ghosts, which is a street in Jerusalem. One of the more fun streets in Jerusalem. But it appears in the Bible to refer to some sort of mythical giant type of creature. Right? And so in Deuteronomy, we learn that Og's bed was 9 feet long because he was such a giant. Who resided in Ashtarot and in Edrei up to the border of the Geshurites and to the Ma'achat heights, and also over part of Gilead down to the border of King Sichon. These two kings, right, were vanquished by Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the Israelites. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, assigned that territory as a possession of the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Okay, so one of the commentaries that I read made a point of saying, look, it's very clear that God did this, right? God actually delivered them into the hands of Moses, right? But God in the book of Joshua, right? God gives all the credit to the Israelites. So there's a midrash about this that I can read if we have time. Okay. All right. And then, right, and the following are the local kings whom Joshua and the Israelites defeated. Right. Once again, right. Obviously, it was God's doing. And here we have it's Joshua and the Israelites.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In a previous chapter, can you go back to the verse where the word Gaza appears?
Sure. Let's see. Right here. I see it in Hebrew.
Verse 22.
The verse 22, exactly.
Yes.
Okay.
So previously, not in the book of Joshua, where the Amalekites were supposed to be destroyed,
Yeah.
but not all of them were, and that caused problems in the future.
Yes.
And in verse 22, it just casually says, but only in Gaza and Ashdod some remained of the Anakim.
Yes.
So that seems like that's going to cause a problem in the future.
Yes. Right. And so there, Suzanne, you are actually pointing to something that I was going to talk about next week. But it's just as well that we raise it here because these are the kind of hints, right, that we get in the narrative, right, that things are not as black and white as the text would like them to be, right, or as maybe the tradition would like them to be, right, that it almost every time it says, oh, the Israelites destroyed them, none alive, that this is a verse where it says, well, they killed them all except for the ones that stuck around in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, but that was just a few. I think we can pretty much say that everywhere it says that they destroyed everybody, there probably should be a verse. Well, they left this one and that one, and they didn't quite get that one. But there's a few verses along the way, right? But by and large, right, it seems like the text really wants us to believe that that there was a complete prescription, right? Which is probably not the case. All right. So to continue with the next verse, the next chapter, right? So here we go, right? There we are. And these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the children of Israel smote between the Jordan westward, from Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, even until the bare mountain that goeth up to Seir. Right, we saw that already. The bare mountain versus Seir, Mount to Seir, and Yehoshua gave it unto the tribes of Israel for possession according to their divisions, in the hill country, and in the lowland, and in the Arava, and in the slopes. Shephelah, I think, would be in the other translation, and in the wilderness, and in the south, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. So again, right, this tradition has Joshua wiping out the Hivites, right? Whereas the other tradition has the Hivites making a pact with Joshua and not being destroyed. Okay, and then we have this really cool poem, basically, right, that looks like this in my it basically has I don't know if you can see that.
No, we can't.
Pretty dark, unfortunately. But it is interesting, right? How there's this sort of you can see on the thing that's on the screen, right? Melech Yericho, right? And then this Samech here that I just circled on the screen. That means there's a space, right, in the biblical in the scroll, right? So every time you see
It's what?
a space, right? It's a samech and
Space.
space, exactly. So there's some sort of space. Okay, I'm not sure what a resh means. But anyway, but Melech Yericho Echad, right? Melech Ha'ai Asher Mitzad Beit El Echad, right? It's almost like it's a sea shanty, right? Where the leader sings the name of a king, right? And the crew says Echad, and so it goes through all of these guys, right? The king of Jericho, the king of Ai, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron,
One,
the king of Yarmouth.
one,
Go ahead.
Echad.
Oh, you were saying Echad for me. Thank you.
Yeah.
King of Lachish,
Echad,
the king of Eglon,
Echad,
the king of Gezer,
Echad,
the king of Debir.
Echad.
Right, I don't think we need to go through all of them, right? But just to sort of point out, right, that when we get to the end, right, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. When we get to the end, right, we Chol Malachim Shloshim ve'echad, right? And when all the kings together, right, it was 31 kings, right? And this one does seem that to imply, right, that the king of Gibeon was not included, right? So it's very interesting how these traditions sort of get woven together. So that would be the 32nd king, right? That's why we don't have 32 kings. But also interesting, right, is that some of the guys that are named in this list are not included in the narrative that preceded, right? So there are people. I think Afek is one. Shimrom, Merom, I think is one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is, not all of these guys are named in the previous narrative. All right, go ahead. So I'm going to stop sharing. We can chat. Okay, go ahead, Connie, and then Naomi.
I'm thinking about annexation.
Yes. Hard not to. So what are you thinking about it, Connie?
I'm thinking how much of this is involved and how much isn't involved. All the places that we've heard about the West Bank to the Mediterranean, the
Yeah.
East, all there.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating question, right? When in this country, right, we tend to teach the Bible as literature, right? In the state of Israel, it often gets taught as history, right? Which is for all the reasons that everyone in the group can probably begin to discuss, right? Makes for some potential complications, right? Not least of all, right, is that the Bible doesn't always agree with itself about what the history was. So I do think that's a big part of it. There was on that topic. If you have access to the New York Times, Peter Beinart wrote a very interesting article today, I think it was, on how he's decided that he's no longer supportive of the two-state solution. He's given up on that.
Oh,
Peter Beinart. I don't know if you know who that is.
I do know
I
who
know.
he is.
Yes.
It was an interesting article. Definitely worth a look. Go ahead, Naomi.
I guess I was trying to think geographically. If we have 32 kings,
Yeah.
what are we talking about, either as the concept of king or the concept of kingdom?
Yeah.
It's beginning to sound as though these kings had maybe half a mile of territory. I know, I'm kind of fascinated by the number.
Right.
And the geographic boundaries.
Yeah. I mean, but I will say though, right, that it's always amazing to me that in Massachusetts there are 300 and something towns and cities.
351.
Yeah. And I'm like, how can there be 351? I mean, that means 351 police departments, and it means 351, local governments, and 351 fire departments, and, and 351 school systems, although, of course, there's, several that are combined and so on and so forth. But
Tell me about it.
in the relatively less dense population of the ancient world, maybe 32 isn't so many. On the other hand, in thinking of them more as mayors, right, rather than as kings of again, thinking in terms of city states rather than nation states. But the other thing I think, which is interesting, right, is that I think that 32 is actually probably not enough, right? There were probably many more settlements, many more local governments, so to speak, that the Israelites didn't encounter, right? These were the ones in the first 11 chapters of Joshua, or first 12 verses of Joshua. These are the ones that either resisted, right, actively went out to fight, or that for whatever reason the Israelites came upon their city and destroyed it. The text next week, right? The text will talk about how much more there is to do, right? A pious reading of that would be that okay, they've conquered the land, but now they need to actually take it over, right, and turn it into an Israelite place rather than a Canaanite place, right? Which is going to be a complicated thing. A less pious reading would be, right, that they came in and they conquered part of the land and they took over some cities, but there's vast amounts of it, right, where nothing has changed, right? Nothing has changed at all. So this midrash, there's several midrashes that I thought were very interesting. But one says, right, that this is a paraphrase of this midrash. Midrash understands the endless city-states of Canaan as embassies. It says in Tanchum Mishpatim, right, if your flag didn't fly in Canaan, then you were a nobody, right? So all of the nations of the world wanted to have an embassy in Canaan. It was that important even before the Israelites had it. Right? Israel was and historically always remained a desired land, a beloved inheritance of the legions of nations, and that comes from the prophet Jeremiah, right? A tiny plot of land coveted and fought over endlessly in ways that utterly defy historical and political logic, right? So this, in a sense, right, is what our tradition is suggesting, right? That this little piece of land is not only important to us, right? It's important to everybody in the world, right? Which now we have a situation where it is, in fact, important to everyone in the world, right? And so that's one of the reasons we have the Jerusalem complex when people go to Jerusalem and start to think that God is talking to them, because obviously they're in the most important place in the world, right? But the ultimate destiny of the land, it says, is not that it be the sole possession of the Jewish nation, a precious jewel to be jealously kept for God's special treasured nation alone. Rather, Jeremiah continues to explain that the smallest of all nations is meant to take this smallest of lands and make Jerusalem into God's seat, and all the nations will aspire to God's name, to Jerusalem, and all the nations will be blessed by it and praised in it, right? And so that's the ultimate goal of Jerusalem, right? Not to kick everybody else out, right? To be sort of the place that everyone goes to. Maybe, but it's another tradition within our tradition.
Yeah, from your mouth to God's ear.
Exactly.
Maybe we could be a peaceful kingdom.
That's right. I mean, from the mind of
Let God not fix
to God's ear. Yeah.
He's in the real estate business. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Never trust a real estate. Never trust a real estate.
There's nothing peaceful in this whole story. I'm going back to that History of the Jews by Abram Soffer that I read. You know, they conquer and they wipe them out and they conquer.
Yeah. I mean, that is, to be honest, that really is a very much a, very much a, very much the reality, right, in the ancient world. This is what people in the ancient world did or aspired to do, right? Was to, go and invade someone's town and, kill everybody and take their stuff. That's, it's difficult to fathom. But unfortunately, I don't think, unfortunately, that human nature has changed that much, of course, but it's
Except that now we destroy the stuff too.
yeah, exactly. Oh, okay. So, I also just want to point out, right, that, in this chapter 12, right, we have Moses and then followed by Joshua, right? And so, once again, which, happens fairly frequently. It happened more at the beginning of the book, but it's still happening now, right? That really emphasizing the lineage from Joshua to Moses, from Moses to Joshua, right? That Joshua is the legitimate inheritor of Moses's role. And here, right, even though Joshua has primarily in the book of Joshua a military role, whereas Moses had primarily a prophetic role, right? Towards the beginning of the book, Joshua did a lot of the sort of Moshe type of stuff with the Torah, right? And here, the Bible is really saying, Moses was also a great military leader, right? Conquering these kings, right? And giving much more space to the details, the specific details of the places that he conquered, than they give to sort of a much more a briefer version of what he gets from Joshua. All right. So, anyone want to make the last? Go ahead, Naomi.
There is not biological descent here.
No.
I suddenly realized that there is no inheritance involved.
Well, that is all, and you're also pointing out something very interesting, a very, another big distinction, right, between Moses and Joshua, right, which is that, as far as I can tell, right, and I may be missing something, right, that we don't hear a lot since the very early parts of the book, right, we don't hear a lot about the priests. Right, and so the priestly caste. That's where the biological lineage is placed. Right, Moses.
The Kohens, yeah.
We know nothing of Moses's children after they're born, and we hear about them, but we don't know what happens to them. And
Zipporah wasn't Jewish.
Say again?
Zipporah was a Moabite.
That's right. But remember, Joshua married Rahav, who was also a ger.
Yeah, right.
So, but I guess that's okay because Joshua's kids are also not going to be,
Moabite.
So nothing has changed.
And what's that only priests through the biological lineage, or that Jews are not good to the women?
The women are not. Those are fighting words for me.
I mean, it is. It's as we've established, right? The tradition is unabashedly patriarchal, right? And it's one of the things we need to always be struggling with, right? How to lift up the role of women when they do appear in the Bible, right? And to try to make sure that sort of patriarchal, those patriarchal structures are as much as we possibly can
Overturned.
undone, right? Overturned. I like that word. Overturned in the world that we live today.
But the problem partly is that for 1200 BC, there was a lot of progressive ideas in Judaism.
Right.
The problem is we're still back there. There were things about how women could inherit property if they married within the tribe.
We'll get to that.
Always a witness to make sure that the bride wasn't dragged unwillingly from her tent to marry this guy. If he divorced her, he had to provide for her sustenance. He couldn't just say, I divorced thee 3 times.
Yeah.
That in 1200 BC was progress.
Pretty good.
We haven't gotten much beyond that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I watched the vote last night, and it wouldn't have passed except that a mother wrote to her son and said, you have to vote for this rights for women. And those not exactly her words, but he wouldn't have voted for it. He was going to vote against it.
Yeah.
And the men have done such a good job.
Oh,
So
no question. There was an article in the, oh, we lost Philip. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, I think it was by Nicholas Kristof, who talked about how the nations in the world that have female heads of state are doing much more effective work in protecting people from COVID-19 than countries with male heads of state. And I don't know if this is true, but it seems to me that someone said the more macho the head of state is, the worse it is. You know, so in Brazil and the United States, right, 2 of the places that's absolutely worse, right? We have these guys that fancy themselves to be macho men. What are you going to do? Go ahead, Connie.
So in the Frostwood Prism the other day, one of the definitions are female leaders, though they didn't say female. So Golda Meir was included, and Margaret Thatcher was included, and Indira Gandhi was included. It must be because it's the week of the women.
See. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you later.
Everybody.
I
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.